The steel cables groaned, a sound like a dying cello string snapping in a hollow room, and then the world simply stopped. Clarine Starling didn't even have time to scream before the lights of the executive elevator flickered, buzzed with a dying electric gasp, and plunged the 3 by 3 foot space into a suffocating velvet darkness. The silence that followed was worse than the mechanical failure. It was the kind of silence that had teeth. "Don't move," a voice commanded from the shadows behind her. It wasn't a human voice, not entirely. It had the texture of grinding stones and the low-frequency vibration of a thunderstorm trapped in a ribcage. Clarine froze, her fingers white-knuckled against the brass railing. She knew that voice. Everyone in the city of Oakhaven knew it. It belonged to the man who owned the top 40 floors of this glass monolith, the man who was rumored to have built an empire on blood and ancient moonlight. This was Lucius Blackwood, the Lycan King, a predator who hid his claws behind Italian silk suits and a billion-dollar portfolio. And now she was trapped in a metal box with him, suspended 600 feet above the concrete, with the emergency brakes as the only thing standing between her and a very permanent end. Hello to everyone tuning in today. I am so incredibly happy to have you here with us for this high-tension journey. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Are you cozy at home or perhaps taking a break from a long day? Let me know in the comments. Also, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me keep these intense, emotional stories coming your way every single week. Now let's get back into that dark elevator where the air is starting to run thin and the tension is just beginning to boil. Clarine's heart was drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was just a junior analyst, a woman who preferred the safety of spreadsheets and the quiet corners of the company library. She had been warned 1,000 times. Never take the private lift. Never look the CEO in the eye. Never, under any circumstances, get caught in his orbit. To the world, Lucius was a ruthless, untouchable ruler whose boardroom tactics were as lethal as his supposed nocturnal transformations. But as the red emergency light finally kicked in, casting a rhythmic, bloody pulse over the small space, Clarine didn't see a monster. She saw a man standing in the corner, his eyes, a piercing, unnatural silver, fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "The internal sensors are dead," Lucius said, stepping forward. The space was so small that his movement forced her back against the control panel. The scent of him hit her, not cologne but something primal, rain-soaked cedar and wood smoke. "We are effectively off the grid." "How long?" Clarine managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "Long enough for things to change," he replied. He didn't look worried about the plummeting elevator. He looked like a hunter who had finally cornered his prize in a place where no one could hear it scream. Clarine reached for the emergency phone, but his hand snapped out, pinning her wrist against the cold steel wall. His skin was burning hot, a feverish temperature that no human should possess. The friction of his thumb against her pulse point sent a jolt of electricity through her that wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she gasped, her breath hitching as his face lowered toward hers. "Because," Lucius whispered, his silver eyes narrowing as he caught the scent of her fear, and her hidden, rising attraction. "I've spent 3 centuries looking for a specific scent, Clarine. And I just found it in a stalled elevator on a Tuesday afternoon." The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Was this mechanical failure really an accident, or had the king finally decided it was time to claim what the stars had promised him? The red emergency light pulsed like a dying heart, casting long, distorted shadows across the brushed steel walls. Clarine Starling could feel the heat radiating off Lucius Blackwood, a literal physical force that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the tiny cabin. Clarine wasn't a woman of high drama. She was a creature of logic and quiet observation. Raised in the shadow of a strictly academic family, the Starlings of New England, she had been taught that the world was a series of equations to be solved. Her deepest fear was the unpredictable, the chaotic, the things that couldn't be indexed in a library or calculated on a ledger. But as she looked up into the silver voids of Lucius's eyes, her logic was failing her. "You're trembling, Clarine," Lucius said, his voice dropping into a register so low it made the soles of her feet vibrate. He didn't move his hand from her wrist. Instead, his thumb began a slow, rhythmic stroke over her pulse. "Is it the height? Or is it the company?" "I don't like being trapped," she whispered, her voice sounding small even to her own ears. Clarine's motivation in life had always been to remain invisible, to be the perfect junior analyst who never made a mistake. She had spent years perfecting a mask of professional indifference, a shield against a world that felt too loud and too fast. But beneath that mask was a woman who spent her nights reading about ancient myths, a woman who felt a strange, hollow ache every time the moon hit its zenith. She had always felt like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong box. Lucius, on the other hand, was the definition of too much. As the head of Blackwood Industries, he was a man of absolute control. The rumors said he never slept, that he could track a scent across 3 states, and that his temper was a literal tectonic event. But here, in the silence of the stalled lift, Clarine saw a different kind of intensity. It wasn't just power, it was a profound ancient loneliness. "They told me you were a ghost," Clarine said, her courage flickering like the emergency light. "That you only appeared when you wanted to destroy something. My supervisor, Marcus Vance, said you don't even have a heartbeat." Lucius let out a dry, mirthless chuckle. "Marcus Vance is a man who fears what he cannot own. And as for my heart..." He took her hand, the one he wasn't pinning to the wall, and pressed it firmly against his chest. Clarine gasped. Beneath the fine silk of his shirt, his heart wasn't beating like a human's. It was a rapid, powerful thrum, like the wings of a hummingbird or the engine of a supercar. It was a rhythm of pure, unadulterated life. "It beats for very specific reasons, Clarine," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. In the corner of the elevator, the intercom crackled with static. A frantic voice broke through. It was Alara Thorne, the head of security and one of the few people who knew Lucius's true nature. "Sir? We have a massive power surge in the basement levels. The brakes are holding, but the electromagnetic locks are fused. We can't get the doors open from the outside. Is the guest safe?" Lucius didn't look at the intercom. He didn't take his eyes off Clarine. "The guest is exactly where she needs to be, Alara. Do not rush the repairs." Clarine's eyes widened. "What do you mean, don't rush? I have a meeting. I have a life." "You had a life of spreadsheets and shadows," Lucius said, finally releasing her wrist, only to bracket her against the wall with both arms. "But the moment you stepped into this car with me, that life ended. You've been hiding your scent under perfumes and soap for years, but in this confined space, there is nowhere for the truth to hide." "What truth?" Clarine asked, her breath hitching as he leaned in so close their foreheads touched. "That you aren't just an analyst. And I'm not just a sieve. We are the ends of a tether that was cut 1,000 years ago. Are you feeling that tension? The air in that elevator is getting thick enough to stir. I have to know, if you were trapped with the Lycan King, would you be trying to escape or would you be asking him to tell you more? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you want to find out what happens when those secrets finally boil over, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now." Clarine looked at the red light reflecting in his silver eyes and realized with a jolt of terror and exhilaration that she didn't want the doors to open. Not yet. She wanted to know why her soul felt like it was finally waking up in the dark. The hum of the building's ventilation system died, leaving a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Clarine Starling watched the digital floor indicator above the door. It was stuck between the 44th and 45th floors, the red numbers flickering with a jagged, dying energy. "The power didn't just surge, Lucius," Clarine whispered, her analytical brain fighting through the fog of his proximity. "The secondary brakes are mechanical, but the floor locks are digital. Someone didn't just stall this lift. They isolated it." Lucius Blackwood's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. His silver eyes darted to the ceiling hatch, then back to her. The air in the elevator suddenly spiked in temperature, smelling of ozone and a dark, predatory musk. "You're more observant than they gave you credit for, little analyst. You're right. This isn't a malfunction. It's an extraction." Before Clarine could ask what that meant, a violent thud echoed from the top of the car. The elevator lurched, dropping 6 inches before the emergency cables screamed and caught. Clarine was thrown forward, her hands instinctively grabbing Lucius's lapels to stay upright. He didn't just catch her. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her flush against the hard, unyielding line of his body. "Stay behind me," he growled, his voice losing its human silk and gaining a terrifying, guttural edge. From the roof of the elevator, the sound of a high-speed thermal drill began to hiss through the reinforced steel. A shower of white-hot sparks rained down, reflecting in the polished brass. "Who is doing this?" Clarine gasped, her heart hammering against his chest. "The Silver Saints." Lucius spat the name like a curse. "An extremist cell of hunters who think the city belongs to the pure. They've been looking for a way to catch me in a confined space where my advantages are limited by silver-lined walls." He looked down at her, and for a fleeting second, the predatory hunger in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, piercing realization. He reached out, his gloved hand tilting her chin up. "They didn't just track me, Clarine. They tracked you. They know what you are, even if you don't." "I'm a junior analyst," she cried, desperation clawing at her throat. "You are the descendant of the Crescent Seers," Lucius said, the words hitting her like a physical blow. "The only bloodline capable of calming the great rage. My rage. They don't want to kill me, Clarine. They want to kill you so I can never be controlled. So I become the monster they need me to be to justify their war." The thermal drill broke through. The ceiling hatch was kicked open with a metallic clang, and a canister was dropped into the small space. Thick acrid green smoke began to hiss out, wolfsbane vapor laced with silver particulates. Clarine began to cough, her lungs burning, but Lucius reacted with a speed that defied physics. He ripped off his designer blazer, wrapping it around her face to filter the air. As the gas filled the cabin, he didn't shift into a beast. He became something far more concentrated. His fingernails lengthened into obsidian points, and his teeth sharpened into a lethal, serrated grin. "Close your eyes, Clarine," he commanded, his voice a low vibration of pure threat. "Lucius, no. Close them." As the first hunter dropped through the hatch, armed with a silver-tipped pulse blade, Lucius lunged. The confined space turned into a whirlwind of violence. Clarine pressed herself into the corner, the smell of copper and ozone filling her senses. She heard the wet thud of impact, the crack of bone, and the stifled screams of men who had made the mistake of thinking a trapped king was a weak one. But then a second hunter fired a taser harpoon. The silver barb sank into Lucius's shoulder, and a high-frequency electric surge forced a roar of agony from his throat. He fell to one knee, the silver in the wire burning his skin with a sickening hiss. Clarine didn't think. She didn't calculate. She lunged forward, grabbing the insulated wire of the harpoon with her bare hands, ignoring the sparks that bit into her palms. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she jerked the wire, unbalancing the hunter on the roof and sending him crashing into the cabin floor. Lucius looked up at her, blood trickling from his mouth, his silver eyes wide with shock. The violet glow she had felt in the library in the dreams was now radiating from her fingertips, neutralizing the silver's burn on his skin. "You." Lucius breathed, his voice thick with wonder. "It's really you. Are you seeing that? The analyst just saved the king. This isn't just a rescue mission anymore. It's an awakening. Do you think Clarine can handle the power she just tapped into? Leave a comment below and let me know if you saw that twist coming. And if you want to see how Lucius reacts to his queen finding her claws, you must subscribe and hit the bell for part 4. The elevator groaned again, the cables fraying under the weight of the struggle. They were trapped, poisoned, and surrounded, but for the first time in her life, Clarine Starling didn't feel afraid. She felt like she was finally home. The elevator was no longer a corporate luxury. It was a vertical war zone. The air was thick with the acrid sting of wolfsbane and the copper tang of blood. Clarine Starling stood over the unconscious hunter she had just grounded, her hands still humming with a strange violet resonance that made the silver-tipped harpoon wire in her grip feel like harmless twine. Lucius Blackwood remained on one knee, his chest heaving, his dark shirt torn to reveal the blackened, smoking entry point where the silver had bitten into his shoulder. He looked at Clarine's hands, at the soft, unmarred skin that should have been blistered by the high-voltage silver discharge, and a low, guttural sound of disbelief rumbled in his throat. "You're absorbing the feedback," Lucius whispered, his silver eyes flashing with a mix of primal hunger and protective fury. "The Crescent Seer blood. It's not just a myth. You're grounding the very thing meant to kill me." "I don't know what I'm doing, Lucius," Clarine cried, her voice cracking. "I just know that if I let go you'll burn." Another heavy thud echoed from the roof. The Silver Saint hunters weren't finished. Through the open hatch, a second canister was dropped, but before it could hit the floor, Lucius's hand snapped out, catching it mid-air and crushing the metal cylinder in his fist, sealing the gas inside. He stood up with a slow, predatory, deliberate motion, his muscles rippling with a strength that seemed to grow the closer Clarine stood to him. "Stay close to me, Clarine," he commanded, pulling the silver barb from his shoulder with a wince of pure steel. The wound didn't bleed red. It bled a shimmering, dark ichor that began to knit itself back together as soon as the silver was removed. "They've blocked the elevator's emergency descent. They're going to try to drop the car to the basement sensors and finish us there. We have to get out of this box," Clarine said, her analytical mind finally snapping back into place despite the adrenaline. "The magnetic locks on the 45th floor are the only things keeping us suspended. If they cut the main cable—" "They already are," Lucius interrupted. As if on cue, a rhythmic snap-snap-snap of steel strands failing vibrated through the floor. The elevator jolted, tilting dangerously to the left. "I can't shift in here," Lucius hissed, his teeth lengthening. "The space is too small and the silver particulates in the air act like a cage for my bones. I'm stuck in this half-state." "Then don't shift," Clarine said, her eyes locking onto his. She reached out, her glowing fingers brushing the dark hair at the nape of his neck. "Use me. You said I was the crescent seer. If I can ground the silver, maybe I can give you the opening you need." The romantic tension in the tiny, flickering space was suffocating. Lucius grabbed her waist, pulling her so close she could feel the frantic, powerful thrum of his heart against her own. His gaze dropped to her lips, his breath hot and smelling of winter storms. For a second, the danger outside the metal walls vanished. There was only the king and the woman fate had trapped him with. "If I do this, Clarine, there is no going back to your spreadsheets," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "The moment our energies lock, you belong to the pack. You belong to me." "I never belonged to the spreadsheets, Lucius," she whispered back. Lucius let out a sound that was half growl, half groan, and crushed his lips against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a desperate electric collision. As they touched, the violet light from Clarine's skin surged into him, turning his silver eyes into twin suns of brilliant white. The pain from the silver poisoning vanished from his expression, replaced by a terrifying absolute clarity. He turned toward the open hatch, his hand reaching up to grip the edge of the roof. With a roar that shook the entire building, he didn't just climb. He surged upward, dragging Clarine with him into the dark, narrow confines of the elevator shaft. They were clinging to the top of the car, suspended in the darkness, as two hunters in tactical gear leveled silver carbines at them from the floor above. "Hold on to me," Lucius roared over the screaming of the wind in the shaft. "Are you holding your breath yet? Because I definitely am. The king and the analyst are literally hanging by a thread, and that kiss just changed the rules of the game. Do you think Clarine's power is enough to get them out of that shaft, or are the Silver Saints just getting started? Leave a comment with your craziest theories. And if you want to see what happens when Lucius finally lets the wolf out, you have to subscribe right now." The main cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The elevator car plummeted into the abyss below them, leaving Lucius and Clarine clinging to a grease-slicked guide rail as the hunters began to fire. The elevator car vanished into the darkness below, a shrieking metal ghost that finally hit the basement buffers with a distant, bone-shaking boom. Clarine Starling clung to Lucius Blackwood's neck, her legs wrapped around his waist, as he held onto the grease-slicked guide rail with one hand. The air in the shaft was a cold, rushing draft that smelled of ancient dust and ozone. Above them, on the 46th floor maintenance ledge, the two Silver Saint hunters peered over the edge, their tactical flashlights cutting through the gloom. "Target is down. Confirming kill," one shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Wait," the other hissed, his light swinging wildly until it snagged on the shimmer of Lucius's silk shirt. "He's on the rail. And he's got the girl." The hunters leveled their silver carbines, but Lucius didn't flinch. He looked up, his silver eyes now swirling with that borrowed violet light from Clarine. He wasn't just a Lycan anymore, he was a conduit. He leaned his forehead against Clarine's, his breath hitching. "I have to show you," he whispered, his voice vibrating through her very marrow. "I have to show you why they really want you dead, Clarine. It's not just about me." "Lucius, they're going to fire," she cried, but he didn't move to dodge. Instead, he pressed his palm against her heart. The world didn't just blur, it shattered. Clarine wasn't in a dark elevator shaft anymore. She was standing in a vision of Oakhaven, but the city was burning. She saw Lucius, not the man in the suit but a monstrous, towering wolf of shadow, tearing through the streets in a mindless, agonizing rage. Beside him she saw the high priest of the Silver Saints, holding a golden leash attached to the wolf's neck. "They aren't trying to stop a monster," Lucius's voice echoed in the vision. "They're trying to create one. Without a crescent seer to anchor my soul, the silver poisoning eventually turns a king into a mindless thrall. They don't want peace, Clarine. They want a Lycan weapon they can point at their enemies." The vision shifted. She saw herself, or someone who looked like her, standing in a sun-drenched library centuries ago, placing a hand on a massive white wolf's head. The wolf calmed instantly, its fur turning from charcoal to silver. "You aren't just a descendant," Lucius's voice grew louder, pulling her back to reality. "You are the rebirth. The stars didn't just bind us by fate, Clarine. They bound us by necessity. If you die, I become the very thing they say I am. If you live, we become the end of their empire." Clarine's eyes snapped open just as the hunters pulled their triggers. The silver rounds whistled through the air, but they didn't hit flesh. A shimmering violet kinetic shield erupted from Clarine's back, expanding like a pair of ethereal wings. The bullets hit the barrier and disintegrated into harmless gray dust. The hunters froze, their faces pale behind their tactical masks. "What the hell is she?" "She is the queen," Lucius roared, his voice finally shifting into the full tectonic rumble of the Lycan King. With a surge of power that sent cracks spider-webbing through the concrete shaft walls, Lucius didn't just climb, he launched. He flew up the remaining 20 feet, landing on the maintenance ledge like a vengeful god. He didn't use a weapon. He simply backhanded the first hunter with enough force to send him through a drywall partition. He grabbed the second hunter by the throat, hoisting him over the abyss. "Tell your priest that the elevator didn't kill us. It just gave us a chance to talk." He dropped the man onto the ledge and turned to Clarine. She was standing there, her hands still glowing, her breathing heavy. The routine day she had started that morning was a million miles away. She looked at Lucius, seeing the blood on his face and the raw, ancient hunger in his eyes, and she realized the midpoint of her life had just passed. There was the woman who feared the dark and the woman who now owned it. "You knew," she whispered, stepping toward him. "You knew I was a seer the moment I walked into the lobby this morning." Lucius straightened his torn shirt, his expression softening into something devastatingly vulnerable. "I knew the moment you applied for the job 6 months ago. I've been watching you, Clarine, waiting to see if you were strong enough to handle the truth. I trapped us in that elevator because I couldn't wait another day to find out." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a random attack. It was a calculated, desperate move by a king who was running out of time. "You trapped me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of betrayal and passion. "I saved you," he countered, stepping into her space, his silver eyes burning. "And in doing so, I let you save me. Are you hearing this? The accident was a setup by the king himself. He literally forced fate's hand in a stalled elevator. Do you think Clarine can forgive him for the deception, or is the bond they just formed too strong to break? Drop a comment right now. I need to know whose side you're on. And don't forget to subscribe because the darkest hour is coming, and the Silver Saints aren't going to let this queen take her throne without a fight." As the building's secondary alarms began to wail, Clarine looked at the man she was fated to, realizing that the most dangerous thing in the building wasn't the hunters or the fall. It was the heart beating inside the man standing in front of her. The 46th floor maintenance ledge was a cold, concrete strip of purgatory. The heavy vibration of the building's secondary alarms felt like a pulse in the soles of Clarine Starling's boots. She looked at Lucius Blackwood, the man she had just saved, the man who had just admitted to orchestrating their confinement. The violet glow on her skin flickered, reacting to the cold spike of betrayal lancing through her chest. "You trapped me," she repeated, her voice a hollow whisper that cut through the wail of the sirens. "The malfunction, the routine day, it was all a cage you built to see if I'd sing?" Lucius took a step toward her, his silver eyes filled with a desperate, fractured light. "I didn't have a choice, Clarine. The Silver Saints were closing in on your apartment. If I hadn't brought you into my territory, into a space I could control, they would have taken you in the night. I had to know if the bond would wake. I had to know if you could ground the silver before they used it to turn me against you. You risked my life to test a theory. Clarine yelled, the power in her veins surging with her anger. A nearby light fixture shattered, raining glass onto the concrete. I risked everything. Lucius roared back, his voice cracking. My company, my secret, my life. I am a king without a crown if you aren't by my side, Clarine. I'm just a ticking time bomb of silver-poisoned rage. But the argument was cut short by a sound that made Lucius's blood run cold. It wasn't a drill or a siren. It was a rhythmic, metallic thrumming coming from the structural pillars of the building. Infrasonic stabilizers, Lucius hissed, his ears twitching as he shifted back into a defensive stance. They aren't just sending hunters anymore. They're using the building's own resonance against me. Suddenly, the floor beneath them groaned. The Silver Saints hadn't just isolated the elevator. They had seized the building's main frame. From the stairwell doors, a new wave of soldiers emerged, but these weren't wearing tactical gear. They were draped in heavy, silver-threaded robes, the High Inquisitors. They carried sensors that billowed a thick violet-black smoke, concentrated nightshade. Separate them, a booming voice commanded. It was the High Priest, his image appearing on a nearby maintenance monitor. Kill the seer. Bring the king to his knees. The smoke hit them like a physical wall. For a human it was a sedative, for a Lycan it was a neurotoxin. Lucius let out a strangled gasp, his knees buckling as the silver-laced smoke invaded his lungs. He tried to reach for Clarine, but a high-frequency sonic blast hit him squarely in the chest, throwing him back toward the open elevator shaft. Lucius! Clarine screamed, lashing out with her violet energy, but the Inquisitors were prepared. They held up mirrors made of polished obsidian that reflected her power back at her. The recoil sent Clarine spiraling into the shadows of the machinery room. She was pinned against a cooling unit, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Through the haze of smoke she saw Lucius struggling to stand. He looked diminished, his silver eyes dulling as the toxin took hold. The hunters closed in, their silver-tipped spears glowing with a predatory light. He's mine, the lead Inquisitor sneered, stepping over Lucius's prone form. And you, little girl, are an evolutionary mistake we are about to correct. Clarine watched in horror as they pressed a silver collar against Lucius's throat. He didn't fight back, he couldn't. His gaze was fixed on Clarine, a look of such profound, agonizing apology that it hurt worse than any weapon. He was being taken. The man who had waited 6 months to find her was being dragged into the dark, and she was too weak to stop them. The Inquisitors kicked Clarine toward the edge of the ledge. Below her was the 600-foot drop into the elevator shaft. Above her, the men who had stolen her destiny were laughing. The king is dead, the priest's voice echoed from the monitor. Long live the Inquisition. Everything was failing. Her power felt like a dying ember, her trust was shattered, and the man she was bound to was being hauled away in chains. For the first time, the routine life she had hated seemed like a paradise compared to this hopeless, freezing reality. The vibration of the building's stabilizers felt like a funeral march. Clarine Starling lay on the edge of the maintenance ledge, her fingers slipping against the cold, grease-slicked concrete. Below her was the infinite black of the elevator shaft. Behind her, the retreating footsteps of the Inquisitors as they dragged a semi-conscious, silver-collared Lucius Blackwood toward the service stairs. Lucius! She croaked, her lungs burning from the nightshade smoke. For a moment, the silence of the routine life she had once lived beckoned. She could just let go. She could slip into the dark, and the weight of being a seer, a queen, and a catalyst would vanish. But then she felt it, a faint, rhythmic thrumming in the air that didn't come from the building. It came from the elevator cable she was still loosely tangled in. It was his heartbeat. Even through the silver collar, even through the distance, the bond wasn't just a tether. It was a power line. I trapped us because I couldn't wait another day. The betrayal that had frozen her heart suddenly melted into a white-hot, incandescent rage. He hadn't trapped her to be a victim. He had trapped her because he knew she was the only one who could survive the storm coming for them both. He didn't want a secretary. He wanted a partner who could look a king in the eye and tell him no. Clarine's eyes snapped open, and they weren't brown anymore. They were a brilliant, shimmering violet that cut through the green nightshade haze like a lighthouse. I am not, she hissed, pulling herself up from the ledge with a strength that cracked the concrete, just an analyst. She stood up, her hair billowing in the artificial wind of the shaft. She didn't reach for the violet light this time, she became it. The obsidian mirrors the Inquisitors held began to vibrate, then shatter, unable to contain the frequency of a seer who had finally accepted her throne. The high priest's voice crackled over the monitor, his tone shifting from triumph to a panicked shriek. Kill her. Use the sonic dampeners. She's peeking. The Inquisitors turned, leveling their sonic cannons, but Clarine didn't flinch. She took a step forward, and with every footfall, a ripple of violet energy surged through the floor, short-circuiting the building's stabilizers. The agonizing hum that had been pinning Lucius to the ground died instantly. Lucius felt the dampeners fail. He felt the silver collar on his neck begin to glow red-hot, not from the Inquisition's power but from Clarine's. She was grounding the silver remotely, turning his leash into a weapon. Lucius, she screamed, her voice a clarion call that shattered every remaining window on the 46th floor. Take it. The king didn't need to be told twice. With the silver neutralized by Clarine's aura, Lucius's body exploded into its true form. The silver collar snapped like a cheap plastic toy. The man in the torn silk suit vanished, replaced by a towering 7-foot beast of shadow and muscle, his fur the color of a midnight eclipse and his eyes glowing with a celestial gold. He didn't just fight the Inquisitors, he deleted them. He moved like a blur of dark lightning, scattering the robed men like dry leaves in a hurricane. But he didn't stay in the fight. He turned back to Clarine, his massive clawed hand reaching out to her. The beast's face was terrifying, a nightmare of teeth and ancient power, but his eyes were soft. They were still his. Clarine ran to him, throwing her arms around the massive wolf's neck, burying her face in his thick winter-scented fur. The violet light and the golden shadow merged, creating a sanctuary of light in the middle of the ruined maintenance floor. We're getting out of here, she whispered into his ear. And then we're going to talk about that elevator. The wolf let out a low, vibrating purr that shook her chest. He turned toward the reinforced glass of the building's exterior, Clarine tucked safely against his side. Are you cheering yet? I literally have goosebumps. Clarine just leveled up and the king is back in his true form. The Inquisition thought they could separate them, but they just forged the strongest bond the city has ever seen. Do you think they can make it to the ground, or is the high priest hiding one last trap in the lobby? Drop a comment. Tell me your favorite part of Clarine's awakening. And you must subscribe for the climactic resolution. The end is near and it's going to be legendary. Lucius didn't look for the stairs. He lunged at the glass, Clarine held tight, as they shattered the world of corporate lies and dived into the open air of the city night. The shattering of the reinforced glass sounded like 1,000 diamonds exploding at once. Clarine Starling squeezed her eyes shut, her fingers buried deep in the thick silver-tipped fur of Lucius Blackwood's neck as they plummeted from the 46th floor. The wind was a screaming banshee, whipping her hair and threatening to tear her from his grip, but Lucius's massive arm was a band of living iron around her waist. He didn't just fall, he aimed. With a roar that vibrated through Clarine's very bones, Lucius kicked off a structural decorative beam, angling their descent toward the glass roof of the grand atrium. Hold on, his voice echoed in her mind, a telepathic thunder. They hit the atrium glass with a catastrophic boom. Shards of tempered safety glass rained down like a glittering curtain as Lucius landed on all fours on the marble floor of the lobby, his claws furrowing deep grooves into the expensive stone. He stood up, shaking the glass from his coat, his golden eyes fixed on the entrance. The lobby wasn't empty. The high priest stood there, flanked by the elite Iron Guard, their shields etched with ancient runes designed to reflect Lycan's strength. Behind them, the building's main power grid hummed, feeding a massive tripod-mounted silver siphon, a weapon designed to drain the life force of any supernatural being within 100 yards. You should have died in the shaft, King, the priest spat, his face twisted in a mask of fanatical hatred. But no matter. Here, in the light of the city, we will show everyone what you truly are. A beast to be put down. The siphon began to whine, a high-pitched frequency that made Clarine's teeth ache. Lucius let out a pained snarl, his massive frame beginning to tremble as the machine started to pull the silver-poisoned energy from his marrow. Lucius, no. Clarine stepped in front of him, her violet aura flaring with a protective, jagged intensity. Move, girl, the priest commanded. Or you burn with him. Clarine looked at the machine, then at the man, the wolf, who had risked his empire just to find her. She realized then that the siphon wasn't just a weapon. It was a vacuum for the very energy she was meant to ground. If she tried to fight it, she'd be drained. But if she became the source. You want the power of the seer? Clarine shouted, her voice echoing through the vast, hollow atrium. She didn't retreat. She walked toward the siphon, her hands open, her violet light turning into a blinding, celestial white. Then take it all. She reached out and grabbed the brass conductive coils of the siphon with her bare hands. The high priest's eyes widened. What are you doing? Stop her. It was too late. Clarine didn't just ground the energy, she overloaded the system. She funneled every ounce of her frustration, her betrayal, and her newfound love into the machine. The siphon couldn't handle the purity of a crescent seer's unfiltered soul. The brass pipes began to glow cherry red, then white as the internal crystals shattered under the pressure. The machine exploded in a shockwave of violet-white light. The iron guard were thrown back like rag dolls, their runic shields cracking into dust. The high priest was lifted off his feet and slammed against the mahogany reception desk, his holy robes scorched and blackened. But the light didn't just destroy the weapon. It washed over Lucius. The silver poisoning that had plagued him for centuries, the darkness that had made him a monster in the eyes of the world, was burned away. The violet-white tide moved through him, knitting his wounds and stabilizing his shift. Lucius didn't just recover, he evolved. His fur shifted from shadow black to a shimmering, iridescent silver gray. He stood upright, a towering figure of majesty and terror, his golden eyes now possessing a depth of wisdom that made the high priest cower in silence. He stepped toward the priest, his shadow falling over the broken man. Lucius didn't use his claws. He shifted back to his human form mid-stride, appearing in the middle of the wreckage in a clean, dark undershirt, his expression one of absolute terrifying calm. The Inquisition is over, Lucius said, his voice a low, steady rumble. Tell the council that Oakhaven has a queen now. And she doesn't like being interrupted. He turned to Clarine, who was standing at the center of the ruined siphon, her hands smoking slightly, her eyes returning to their natural brown, though a spark of violet remained in the depths. Are you okay? He asked, his voice thick with a vulnerability he had never shown another living soul. Clarine looked at the wreckage of her routine day, then at the man who had turned her world upside down. She walked over to him and without a word slapped him across the face. Then before he could react, she pulled him into a kiss that tasted of ozone, ash, and forever. We are definitely talking about the elevator, she whispered against his lips. Can you believe the power Clarine just displayed? She didn't just save the king. She broke the weapon of the Inquisition with her bare hands. I am literally cheering in my seat. What was your favorite part of that atrium showdown? Leave a comment. Did you expect the siphon to explode like that? And you cannot miss the final part of this journey. Hit that subscribe button for the satisfying conclusion. The sirens of the city police were approaching, but as Lucius wrapped his arm around Clarine, shielding her from the dust, it was clear that the law of the city had just changed. The king and the queen had arrived. The morning sun of Oakhaven didn't just rise. It shattered the gloom of the previous night, casting long golden fingers of light through the broken ribs of the Blackwood Industries atrium. The glass-strewn marble floor, once a battlefield of silver and shadow, was now a quiet monument to a lopsided war. Clarine Starling stood at the center of the wreckage, her torn blouse fluttering in the cool morning draft. She wasn't an analyst anymore. She was a woman who had tasted the sun and survived. Lucius Blackwood stepped through the debris, his movements fluid and silent. He had found a clean dark coat to throw over his shoulders, but the man underneath was forever changed. The silver-gray sheen of his soul bond with Clarine remained visible in the way his eyes caught the light, no longer just a predator's silver but a steady, calm gold. The board of directors is calling an emergency session, Lucius said, his voice dropping into that low magnetic register that no longer made Clarine's heart race with fear, only with a deep, resonant belonging. They want to know why their CO jumped out of a window and why the high priest is currently being processed by the city police for domestic terrorism. Clarine turned, a small, tired smile playing on her lips. Tell them it was a highly unconventional team-building exercise. And that I'm expecting a very significant raise. Lucius laughed, a sound that was no longer dry or mirthless. He reached out, his fingers intertwining with hers. The violet spark in her eyes flared briefly, a warm hum of energy passing between them that felt like a permanent, invisible tether. A race? Clarin, you own half the mountain now. You are the crescent seer. The city's pulse belongs to you as much as it does to me. I just wanted to get through a Tuesday without being poisoned, Lucius, she teased, though she didn't pull her hand away. The romantic resolution between them was a steady, grounding force. They had been trapped by fate, forced into a metal box to face their darkest truths, and they had emerged not as victims, but as a unified front. The obsession that had driven Lucius to watch her for 6 months had transformed into a profound, mutual respect. He didn't just want her by his side, he needed her there to keep the world and himself in balance. In the weeks that followed, the routine of Oakhaven changed. The Silver Saints were disbanded, their influence scrubbed from the city's infrastructure by a king who now had the moral authority of a queen to guide him. Elara Thorne remained the head of security, but her new primary directive was no longer protection, it was cooperation. Clarin moved her office to the top floor right next to Lucius's. They didn't just share a floor, they shared a vision. The fracture she had felt her entire life, the sense that she was a puzzle piece in the wrong box, was gone. She was exactly where she was meant to be. One last thing, Clarin said one evening months later as they stood in a brand new much larger elevator on their way to a gala. She hit the stop button, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Lucius raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at his lips. You're trapping me now? Bold move, my queen. I just wanted to say, Clarin stepped into his space, her hands finding the lapels of his perfectly tailored suit. Thank you. For the elevator. For the truth. And for not letting me walk away when the doors finally opened. Lucius leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. I couldn't have let you go if I tried, Clarin. You were the only thing in this world that made sense to me. The elevator stayed still for a long time, not because of a malfunction or an attack, but because two people had finally found their center in a world that used to be a nightmare. The obsession was gone, replaced by a love that was as enduring as the moon itself. Wow, what an incredible journey. We went from a terrifying mechanical failure to a literal awakening of a queen. I am so happy we got to see Clarin find her power and Lucius find his peace. This story shows that sometimes, the things that trap us are the very things that set us free. What did you think of the ending? Did you love seeing Clarin take charge, or was Lucius's transformation your favorite part? Leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this 40-minute emotional roller coaster, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thank you for being part of this community, and I'll see you in the next one. As Clarin hit the start button, the elevator glided upward, smooth and silent. The doors opened to a world that was finally ready for them, and together they stepped out into the light.